Hey, what's up? Today we're talking about scanning Polaroids and other instant film. Now, scanning Polaroids seems like it would be a pretty straightforward thing, like, just point your camera at a Polaroid and take a picture of it and you're done. But it's actually a bit more involved than that. It's not overwhelming, but there is some things that you want to keep in mind to get the best scan possible for your images. Now, first off, why would you want to scan your Polaroids? Well, that's pretty self-explanatory. Everything happens online these days, so if you want to share any of your images, you're going to need to digitize them somehow. So, what's the best way to go about it? Well, as I mentioned, you can just take a picture with your phone, but Polaroids have kind of a glossy surface, and they cause problems in more ways than one, but often if you just take a picture of them, you're going to get some reflections, and it's not always going to look great. So I have a scanner here. It's the EPSON V600. I used to use the Scan 900F Mark I, then they had a Mark II, and then Canon just stopped making them. And I really liked that scanner, but they don't make it anymore. The V600 is the one I use, and we'll get into all the settings and everything in a minute. That's the basic piece of equipment you need. The V600 isn't terribly expensive, and I do recommend investing in a dedicated flatbed scanner if this is something that you want to do seriously. In a pinch, a consumer printer scanner can work, but it is definitely a lower quality because those are generally meant for scanning documents, and scanners like this are more optimized for scanning art and scanning pictures and even film if you want to use it for that. That's the first piece of equipment you're going to need. Obviously, you're going to need a computer to connect the scanner to. The other major thing, and the reason I've kind of put off making this video for a while, is you're going to need a scan adapter. So what a scan adapter is basically if you just plop a Polaroid straight on the glass, let's take a flatbed, just put it on there, you're going to have problems because there's a little plastic glossy layer on top of the Polaroid, and when it makes contact with the glass, it causes what's called Newton rings. And these rings are like little oily patches. They look like the rainbows reflected in oil, and they just ruin images. They're terrible to deal with because they're not even specks that you can easily Photoshop out. They're usually these rings that will just kind of run along a part of the image, and it's a total pain to deal with. So you have to use a scan adapter, which what it does is it creates just the smallest amount of space between the image and the glass just to prevent those rings from forming. Now, years ago, the Impossible Project made scan adapters. You just taped, they even had glue on them, you just taped your image in and you put it on and you were good to go. But then the Impossible Project stopped making it. Polaroid Originals never continued making it, and they're definitely not making it today. So I was kind of stuck because I didn't know what to recommend to people. These are pretty simple items. They're just pieces of plastic. So if you're smart and know how to use a 3D printer, you could probably make one of these pretty easily. But I couldn't. I didn't know how to make the schematics or anything. But thankfully, Brooklyn Film Camera has come to the rescue, and they've teamed up with Camera Dactyl to basically 3D print new scan adapters. So scan adapters are your other necessary piece of equipment if you really want to do a good job of scanning your images. And everything I'm saying today applies to Polaroids, but it also applies to Fuji Instax if that's kind of your bread and butter. All right, so you got everything you need. Now you have your computer, you have your scanner, and you have your scan adapter. Let's talk about how to use the scan adapter. Basically, all you do is tape your images in there. It's very kind of straightforward. There's little gaps. These holes are there so you can pull things in and out. So you're just going to, you can use double-sided tape. I use just regular Scotch tape. And this is kind of a tedious part of the process, so I'm going to speed through here. But you just kind of put a row of you make the smallest loops you can because you really don't want the picture hanging. And Polaroids kind of have a tendency to bow out. So even if you use a scan adapter, if you're not careful, part of the image can still make contact with the glass. So here I got 5 pieces of tape on here, and we're just gonna place it in this thing right here. If you have, I've already scanned these pictures before, but if you're scanning something new, typically I will wipe down the Polaroid with a cloth just to make sure I don't have any like huge fingerprints or anything on it. Now that we got the picture in there, we're just gonna put it face down and close it. Image is loaded. Now let's talk about the digital side of things. Now I use Macs to scan. I edit mostly on Windows, but I use Macs to scan because I really like the default image capture software that comes with Macs, like MacBooks, iMacs, and all that. If you're scanning on Windows, I recommend using ViewScan. I don't really like Windows default scanner that much, but you can use it. You can make it work. ViewScan is a program you have to pay for. I used it for many years. It works great. Works with basically every scanner on the planet. But for my money, I really do like using Macs. So that's what we're going to use today to kind of look through settings. But these settings do apply to any other apps that you may use. So we're going to take a look here. So image capture, when it opens, will kind of come up with this like really simplistic screen. We want to go on show details. And now it's going to do an overview scan. And we sit here patiently and we wait for it. All right, so the settings that it starts with are pretty basic. First thing you want to do is you want to establish what your resolution is. By default, it's 50 dpi, which is ridiculous. I generally like to scan at 2400 dpi because once I scan these images, I wanted to have all the quality I can use. I often make prints out of them that are fairly big. 1200 is fine. Like you can kind of get away with that. But for me, I always use 2400. It does result in huge files. So that's going to be the DPI that we use. Obviously, you want to be color. We're on flatbed. Millions versus billions of colors. So that's Mac's way of talking about bit depth. For a long time, I would always scan with billions because I wanted to make sure I had the most data possible. But then I realized I was just having gigantic files that were just clogging up all my systems. So I moved, and when I scanned on Windows, I didn't use the billions level bit depth with ViewScan. So I just stay with millions, especially if I'm working with a black and white image or something that doesn't have like a lot of color info. But if you are planning on doing a ton of work on your image, you know, you can make a call of whether or not which bit depth to do. I will say though that the files that come out of billions scanned at 2400 DPI are massive. You will fill up hard drives really quickly if you do a lot of things. So you select your scan to. Often it's good to name your file something you'll remember because there's no metadata embedded in film images. We're kind of take that for granted with digital cameras, like you know what model lens you use, the shutter speed, all that. So it's a good reminder to like include in a file name what camera you used and what film it is, if you can remember it. This is, I believe, Polaroid 680, and I shot it using Impossible Project 600 back in the day. This is an older picture. Format TIFF, I always keep it just as TIFF file. You have your options, but TIFF is going to give you the most like flexibility. And then obviously you can ignore all these other things. And the other thing, you just want to, actually select your image. So you can use auto select, but I just selected myself. So once this is all set, we can go ahead and just click scan. And now we sit here and wait patiently. If you have multiple images, you can select multiple, you can make multiple squares. So it'll just go through and scan 4 pictures at a time, which is really helpful. And something that's also nice about scan adapters. Now, while we're sitting here waiting for the scan adapter to do its thing, one thing that is kind of an artistic decision that you get to make when you're dealing with scanning Polaroid film is whether or not to really include the white borders or whatever other color they might end up being in your scans. When I make the initial scan, I always include them just so I have them if I ever need them. But when I actually print and distribute my Polaroid images, I always crop the border out because I don't want to draw too much attention to the medium. Like I'm using Polaroid as a tool to get a certain type of image, but I'm not trying to use it to say like, hey, I shot a Polaroid. All right, drum roll. Scanning does unfortunately take a while. You know, it requires just enough input that you can't just totally let it go off on its own and do whatever you want. You have to like kind of interact with it every few minutes. So it's kind of a time suck, but what can you do? It's scanning. So now that we got the image done, we can take a look at it, see what we got. One thing that you want to do is check for Newton rings and make sure that there isn't any, you want to make sure that there's nothing wrong with the image before you kind of put everything away. On the image I'm seeing here, there's no Newton rings, which is good, but there does seem to be some sort of like dirt or dust or something on the image. So if I hadn't already scanned this, I would check that out, make sure that everything was good there. So yeah, that's how you scan a Polaroid image. That you basically, once you have the TIFF file, you can take that and import it into Lightroom. You can store them, organize them however you want. Generally with Polaroid images, I like to do a little bit of color correction on all of them to make them look like what they do in real life. Now, there's no pure accurate way that a Polaroid ever looks, because since it's an object, it really depends on what light it's in, on how it looks. And often a Polaroid will look like it has deeper blacks and more contrast when you're looking at an actual image than it does on a screen, but that's because, you know, you're looking at a backlit screen versus a, you know, object, a piece of ink on a paper. So I often like to do some work to restore that contrast, because generally a scan will seem kind of flat, a little lifeless. The color accuracy will usually be pretty good. Sometimes if there's something wrong, like you want the color to be slightly different, you can, you know, do that creative kind of change in Photoshop. You can really just use it like 35mm or anything else. It's just a basis to start your work. Now, before you go, because you stuck it out this long, and I'm quite impressed listening to my ramblings, there is one thing that I've noticed over the years, that if you don't care about the borders of an image, how you can get even better results sometimes in the image itself. So when I say the borders, I mean like the little white frame on the thing. So a lot of Polaroids tend to bow out, and when you're scanning a lot of them, they'll keep touching they'll keep bowing out past the scan adapter and touching the glass. So what I often do is, you know, I had to do this. I discovered it because I had to use a incorrect scan adapter a lot. So when I put my 600 images in, they wouldn't quite fit in there, and the bottom lip would kind of stick out of the recessed area. But what that did was it essentially caused the picture to bow in the opposite direction, and only this part was touching the glass, and it would prevent the rest of the picture from ever touching the glass. So I often still use this scan adapter for like 600 film because of that. But you can do that in the other scan adapter too. You basically just, you use the lower part, and you want to make sure that the whole Polaroid itself is firmly below the lip, and it's just the white part there that is making contact with the glass. But that tends to work for me. If I'm struggling with pictures that are particularly bowed, that's like a good trick. Otherwise, you're fine just doing it normal. But sometimes, especially when film is fresh out of the camera or something like that, it can have more of a curvature to it, or if it's stored incorrectly. So that is everything I know about scanning. Hope you enjoyed this video, and happy shooting.